Should I tell him? How will I tell him? Her thoughts raced as she leaned back against the couch. The pregnancy test still fresh in her mind, two pink lines. The word of the truth settled like a stone in her chest. That night, when he had come home drunk from the party, changed everything. He had not remembered a thing the next morning, and she had not dared to bring it up. Now she was carrying his child, and the idea of telling him made her stomach twist into anxious knots. Will he be angry, disappointed? What if he blames me? Her fearful thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door creaking open. Wine's breath hitched. Jungkook stepped inside, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. He looked exhausted, but there was something more, a heavy tension in the way. His jaw was clenched and his brows were furrowed. Whatever had happened at work, it had put him in a terrible mood. Her fearful thoughts were interrupted by the sound of wine. Immediately stood up, instinctively trying to make herself smaller. She grabbed a glass of water with shaky hands and approached him cautiously, like she was stepping toward a straw. Here, drink this. Chonguk took the glass without looking at her. Drowning the water in one long gulp, he didn't say thank you or offer any acknowledgement. His silence was suffocating, the cold aura around him freezing any attempt at conversation. You should freshen up, I will hate the food. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She hated how small it sounded, but the lump in her throat made it impossible to speak any loud. Fine. The word was curt, clipped. Without sparing her a glance, he turned and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. One let out a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling as she made her way to the kitchen. She busied herself heating up the food, the clinking of dishes, the only sound in the quiet apartment. The silence wasn't comforting, it was the kind of silence that pressed down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. As she set the table, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. I can't tell him tonight, not when he is in this mood. Every few moments, she glanced toward the hallway, her nerves stretching tighter with each passing second. Her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. When Jungkook returned, his expression had not softened. He sat down without a word, his posture rigid. The cold aura around him felt even stronger now. Wine placed the food in front of him before sitting across the table. She kept her eyes down, focusing on her plate. Her fingers twisted nervously under the table, and she fought the urge to get with the hem of her shirt. Jungkook sat at the dining table, his expression unreadable as he ate. The sound of his fork scraping against the plate echoed in the quiet room, adding to the tension that had settled like a thick cloud. Wine sat across from him, her food untouched. She couldn't stop staring at him. His sharp features, the way his eyes darkened, with whatever frustration he had brought home from work. Her gaze drifted to his hands, the same hands that had once held her so tightly that night. Her heart thumped loudly in her chest. She wanted to say something, but the words died before they reached her lips. Jungkook, as always, as distant, cold. Suddenly, his fork paused midair. He didn't look up at first, but the shift in his posture made her stomach tighten. After a few more silent seconds, he lifted his gaze to hers. Why are you staring at me? His voice was low, calm, but there was an edge to it, like he wasn't in the mood for games. Wine's breath hitched. I wasn't. Jungkook raised a brow, clearly inconvenienced. You're been staring for a while now. What is it? Wine's heart trembled under the table. She quickly grabbed her spoon to keep herself busy. It's nothing. I just got lost in thought. He studied her for a moment longer, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. She felt like he could see right through her. If you have something to say, just say it. Wine quickly shook her head. No, really, it's nothing. Jungkook let out a quiet but the coldness in his expression didn't waver. He gave her one last glance before returning his attention to his food. Wine lowered her gaze to her plate, picking at her food with trembling fingers. The ache in her chest returned, heavier than before. She wanted to tell him so badly, but fear chained her words down. The rest of the meal passed in suffocating silence. After finishing his meal, Jungkook wiped his mouth with a napkin, his movements precise and cold. He didn't say a word, not a simple thank you or even a glance in Wine's direction. He stood up and walked away, leaving the room as if she didn't exist. Wine's shoulders slumped the moment he disappeared into the hallway. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the words she couldn't say and the ones he would never hear. She leaned forward, resting her head on the dining table. Why did I think tonight would be any different? Her voice was barely a whisper, spoken only to the quiet emptiness around. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing she could lock away the pain, but it stayed right there in her chest, an ache that wouldn't go away. After a few moments, she pushed herself up, wiped the tears that tend to fall, and headed to the kitchen. She washed the dishes slowly, letting the sound of the running water drown out her thoughts. Once she finished, Wine dried her hands and made her way to their bedroom, the only thing they shared in this cold, empty marriage. Theirs had never been a marriage of love. Jungkook had loved someone else, Kang Sebyeok. She was everything. Mrs. Jones disapproved of cunning, calculating, and obsessed with appearances. Sebyeok's fake smiles and heavy makeup couldn't hide her true nature from Jungkook's mother. Mrs. Jones had forced the marriage, believing Wine's kindness, simplicity, and caring nature would be better for her son, but Jungkook didn't see it that way. He had never accepted Wine, not as his wife, not as anything. And though she would known from the start that he was in love with someone else, it was only after the wedding that she learned how deeply he resented being forced into it. Wine had hoped that with time things would get better, that maybe, just maybe, Chunga would soften toward her, but he had not. He remained cold, distant, a stranger in every way. That mattered. As she reached the bedroom door, Wine froze. Jungkook's voice filtered through the half open door. She couldn't see him, but his words were sharp, cutting straight to her heart. I will divorce her soon. I can't right now, but I will. Just wait. Wine felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her breath caught in her throat and her hands went numb. Divorce? He wants to leave me. Her eyes stung as tears began to blur her veil. One escaped sliding down her cheek. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach where the smallest life was growing. A life Jungkook didn't even know about yet. Where will I go? What will I do with my baby? Her heart broke into a thousand pieces. She stood frozen outside the door, her tears falling silently as the weight of the future crashed down on her. Wine wiped her tears hastily, forcing herself to pull it together. With a deep, shaky breath, she pushed the bedroom door open and stepped inside. Jungkook, seated on the edge of the bed with his phone in hand, looked up at her. His sharp gaze lingered for a moment before he cut the call without another word. His expression was cold, but something flickered in his eyes curiosity, maybe, or suspicion. Wine didn't meet his eyes. She walked straight to the bathroom, closing the door behind her. Inside, she leaned over the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, and her eyes were swollen from cry. No matter how much she tried to hold it in, the tears kept falling. She splashed water on her face, but it didn't help. The ache in her chest was too deep, too raw. The sound of the tap running was only thing keeping her sobs from echoing in the quiet room. How did it come to this? Why am I still hoping for him to care? She sank to the bathroom floor, curling her knees to her chest. For what felt like an eternity, she sat there, sobbing softly, letting the pain pour out of her. When she finally emerged 45 minutes later, her eyes were red and puffy. She had not even taken a shower. There had not been enough strength left in her for that. Jungkook, who had been laying on the bed with his phone in hand, noticed the state she was in. His eyes narrowed slightly. As he observed her, she was avoiding his gaze. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She was crying for that long. What happened to her? He thought about asking but stopped himself. His pride, his walls, they were too strong. So instead, he placed his phone down and lay on his side. Pretending to sleep, one climbed into bed beside him. Trying to be as quiet as possible, she turned her back to him, pulling the blanket up to her chin. But a quiet sniffle betrayed her. Jungkook heard it. His mind replayed everything. The way she avoided his gaze, the redness in her eyes, the sadness in her every movement. Is she okay? But the question remained unspoken. And soon the silence of the night settled over them. Jungkook drifted off to sleep while Wine lay wide awake, her tears soaking the pillow beneath her. It was 3 a.m. when Jungkook stirred in his sleep, shifting to his other side. His mind was foggy from exhaustion, but a sudden hurried movement jolted him awake. He opened his eyes just in time to see Wine bolting from the bed, running barefoot toward the bathroom. Jungkook sat up, frowning. Something didn't feel right. Without thinking, he got up and followed her. The sound of retching filled the bathroom. Wine was hunched over the toilet, her body trembling as she vomited. A strange, unfamiliar urgency gripped Jungkook. He rushed to her side, kneeling down beside her. Wine, he held her hair back, his hand steady even though his heart felt unsettled. Wine looked up at him, her tear filled eyes wide with surprise. She couldn't believe that she was seeing Jungkook. The same cold man who barely acknowledged her was now kneeling beside her, helping her. Once she was done, he grabbed a tissue and gently wiped her mouth. His touch was soft, so different from the distance he usually kept between them. Come on, let's get you back to bed. Without another word, he helped her stand and led her back to the room. He made her sit on the edge of the bed, then handed her a glass of water. Here, drink this. White took the glass, her fingers trembling. She sipped the water, her eyes never leaving his face. Shock and confusion swirled in her mind. Why is he doing this? Why is he suddenly caring? Jungkook sat beside her, his gaze calm but serious. Are you okay? One didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, tangled with all the emotions she didn't know how to express. Why were you vomiting? You feeling sick? I was just not feeling well. Her voice was barely audible, filled with hesitation. Oh, okay, then we will visit the doctor tomorrow. No arguments. Wine nodded slowly, still too stunned to say much. Jungkook stood up and helped her lie down. He adjusted the blanket over her before going back to his side of the bed. Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different. There was no cold wall between them, just questions and emotions hanging in the air. They both lay back down, and Jungkook's eyes stayed open a little longer, his mind replaying the scene in the bathroom. Wine, too, stared at the ceiling, her heart beating fast for reasons she didn't quite understand. The next morning, Wine stood in the kitchen, finishing the breakfast preparations. It was already 9:30 a.m., and Jungkook had not left for the office yet. Isn't he going to work today? She wondered, nervously glancing at the clock. A few minutes later, Jungkook emerged dressed in casual clothes. They sat down at the dining table, eating in silence, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken thoughts. Go and get ready. I'm waiting in the living room. We're going to the doctor. No, I'm feeling better. Go. His voice was cold and firm, leaving no room for argument. Once her saying she had hoped to avoid this visit, but there was no escaping it. She got up from the table and changed into a simple dress, her nerves going by the minute. They arrived at the clinic where they were greeted by Mrs. Han, a polite and kind hearted doctor. After running some tests, Mrs. Han walked into the room with the results. Congratulations, your wife is 3 weeks pregnant. What? His voice exploded through the small room, making Wine flinch. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, her words were coming to life. Mrs. Han frowned at Chung's reaction. Mr. John, I understand this may be a surprise, but you need to take care of her. She will need proper rest, nutrition, and emotional support. This is a critical time for both her and the baby. Jungkook barely listened. He grabbed Wine's wrist, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her out of the clinic without a word. The drive home was tense. Jungkook was overspeeding, his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. Wine sat in silence, staring out the window, her thoughts a chaotic mess. When they arrived home, Jungkook led her to the living room. His eyes were cold, filled with a mix of confusion and anger. How did this happen? I never touched you. So how? Wine froze, her heart stopping for a moment. His words felt like a slap to her face. Was he accusing her? What what are you trying to say? Whose child are you carrying? The room went silent for a second and then slap. Wine's hand flew across his face, leaving a red mark on his cheek. Don't you have any shame? You are pointing at a woman's character, your own wife's character.